Good afternoon, and may I extend a really warm welcome to you as you join our webinar, Women Blueprint for Balance, an ambitious new approach to inclusion, brought to you by the Chartered Management Institute, or CMI. My name is Dr. Chan Abraham. I'm a Chartered Fellow of CMI with a passion to help inspire and energize a renaissance of leadership. Shortly, I will be delighted to hand over to the stars of our webinar, Alison Maitland and Rebecca Steele. They're the co-authors of the book Indivisible, and they will explain an ambitious new approach to inclusive leadership as part of our Blueprint for Balance series around the 6 themes of balanced recruitment, mentoring and sponsorship, promoting leadership equality, skills and career development, flexible working pay and rewards. First, a little background and some housekeeping. CMI's Women's Network was established 50 years ago to promote women in management, with diversity and inclusion at the heart of great leadership, which, as I say, I also am seeking to energize through my work in Leadership International and as part of the CMI. Blueprint for Balance is CMI's innovative open source tool to promote diversity in the workplace, supporting CMI's objective of producing the world's strongest pipeline of women in management. We're always looking for new resources, so if you'd like to suggest any, please do so on the Blueprint for Balance page. And if you have any questions during the webinar, you can ask them using the live chat box on the right of your screen, and we will answer as many as we can. And finally, today's session is being recorded, so it will be shared with you later on today for those of you who booked to attend. It will also be available in Management Direct for those of you who already are members. So let's fire the starting pistol, and please join me as I welcome Alison and Rebecca and hand over to you to begin.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for that lovely warm welcome, Chan. And it's great to see so many of you here today to talk about and to get insights into this really critical issue of inclusion. So I'm just going to begin by saying something about the big picture. In recent months, with the COVID-19 pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement, both of them have, in different ways, really starkly underlined the urgency of getting inclusion right in organizations and in society. Many divides have been exposed, and these are just some of them. We've seen how coronavirus hits marginalized ethnic groups and also elderly people much harder than the rest of the population. We've seen how the economic fallout of COVID is impacting young people, it's impacting women, and it's impacting socioeconomically disadvantaged people particularly hard. We've also seen the critical role of key workers, caregivers, food retailers, transport staff, people like refuse collectors and delivery drivers, in really ensuring the well-being and the smooth running of society. We've also seen how many of those key workers exist in low-paid and precarious and marginalized employment. We've seen systemic injustices in society and in organizations that have been laid bare by the police killings of African Americans in the US and the ensuing resurgence of Black Lives Matter protests across different countries. And we've also seen extreme examples of both caring and careless leadership on the international stage, demonstrating actually how inclusion can make the difference between life and death. Now, most organizations know that they must do better with diversity and inclusion, but they often struggle with the how, and that's what this webinar is about. So we're going to look at the limitations of many current D&I initiatives and explain how a comprehensive and systemic approach can really help organizations to achieve sustainable results through better understanding, measuring, and taking action on the whole of inclusion. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you for setting that out Alison. Indeed, we are seeing that organizations that are succeeding in advancing inclusion during this crisis are those that are putting it at the heart of their business. In our book, we describe, sorry, just having a moment of the slides not lining up here. But in our book, we do describe inclusion as harnessing the collective superpower of diversity. And we have an ambitious but realistic vision for inclusion, where inclusion is linked to business priorities and comprehensively, indivisibly integrated into how the business operates. Because when inclusion flourishes, it permeates the whole work environment, and that enables everyone to succeed without leaving anyone out. So in our book, we give a lot of examples of what this looks like. And to share just a handful of those, we see people being skilled at actively building connections and relationships and being able to combine different perspectives and different strengths for important outcomes like innovation. We see research and design teams pulling a wide array of insights and ideas from different people so that they can co-create breakthroughs in products that service either new or overlooked markets. And we also see a full range of people participating in saying how the organization should work so that they can refine the structures and the systems that shape the organization and keep it open to everyone. And these companies also invest in including a full range of external stakeholders, like suppliers and customers and investors who buy the company's products, who buy the company's shares, because its inclusive reputation really attracts talent and markets. Alison, what would you add about our vision for the collective?
So I think I'd just add something about what we see companies doing externally. So we also envisage, and we're drawing here on the experience of some existing collaborative initiatives, that leading organizations will seek to tackle exclusion externally as well as internally. So they would use their influence and combine with other organizations to build bridges across economic and social divides. So they will address systemic injustices in things like education and healthcare and access to jobs and fair pay. And those things, their actions in society, across society, which will represent their purpose, will in turn kind of support and enhance their internal inclusion work. So that's, we're setting out the big picture in brief. We'd like to go back to basics and start with the question of how do we actually define inclusion versus diversity? And it's important here to be clear about this, to be clear actually what you are talking about, partly because these words are sometimes have slightly different meanings or slightly different understandings in different cultures, but also because they're often actually conflated. So they're often diversity and inclusion is often, in the same breath. So the inclusion part of it can be something of an afterthought. It can be the poor relation. We've often seen that it is the poor relation compared with diversity. And we really define diversity as that vast mix of individual identities, of backgrounds, of perspectives, of strengths and talents, and all of that, and experiences that is a reality in the workforce, in society, and in the workforce. And it's interesting because diversity is often seen as a problem to be addressed, but we can also see it as an incredible opportunity for organizations to seize. And so the way that we define inclusion is really seizing that opportunity, what we call harnessing the collective superpower of diversity, of all of our differences and all the things that we contribute. And doing that by creating environments in which every person counts, every voice is heard, everyone can achieve their full potential. And the value of everyone is inextricably, is indivisibly linked and wrapped up with the success of the organization. So the important point here is that without inclusion, diversity remains unfulfilled potential. And that's actually really why we focused this book on inclusion, because it is so absolutely critical. So we do have a poll, an audience poll. We've got a few audience polls for you. So if we could have that up now. And we're going to be asking you what your understanding is, what your feeling is about how well you understand what needs to happen in your organization to become more inclusive.
Right. So to participate in the poll, and we hope you all do, you'll just need to go to the website on the slide being shown, and you'll enter your name, and then we'll activate a question. So please take just a moment and get into that link so that you can participate in the poll.
And we're looking forward to hearing from you all.
So we might want to proceed with that first poll question. You should see it coming live to you. We just want to ask, do you understand what needs to happen for your organization to become inclusive? And we're seeing, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, so we're seeing quite a, well, that's a very stark result there. So the vast majority of you saying that you're not sure. We're moving around a little bit. Some people are sure, and some are saying no. Okay, so it's still moving. Actually, I'm going to wait, give it a few more seconds.
Yeah, and we do see this sort of reflecting some of what we see as we work with organizations. There's some that are very certain, and some that are very uncertain, and of course some in between. We do find that sometimes there are elements of inclusion that organizations aren't aware of, that mean that they don't quite have a full understanding yet, and that's part of why they might not be seeing the results that they're really aiming for. But this is very similar to what we often see when we're talking to the organizations that we work with.
So thank you for taking part in that poll. So it looks like it's sort of fairly evenly balanced between yes and not being sure, and a few people who feel no.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you.
Yes. So we want to then ask you another poll straight away. Why does inclusion matter to organizations to get this right? You're not limited to answering only one selection. You certainly could check more than one. But we want to see from your perspective or from your organization's perspective why it's important to get inclusion right. And right now we're seeing a lot of people balancing in between the right thing to do and also looking at the importance of the impact on creativity and innovation. We'll see if anything else shifts around.
It's shifting right now. This is really fun to watch this as the results come in. Oh.
So some people are selecting each of the options with a really notably higher number of people talking about creativity and innovation. Yeah, so it looks like it's perhaps settling in right here. And again, very much appreciate your participation. It means a lot. And, when we look at the evidence, we see that, of course, all of these are part of the right answer. And there are even more reasons that inclusion is important to get right. one important thing is that inclusion is actually a business driver. And it does, for example, have a big impact on a lot of elements of performance, like the ones listed on this slide. For example, such as being able to leverage a mix of ideas and ways of solving problems that can really boost breakthrough innovation. Allison, what would you add to that?
Yes, I think it's important to recognize that, you know, some of these things will be very familiar to people, and some perhaps less so. So I think in the performance column that you've got there, it's useful to look at risk reduction as well as the sort of like the positives. That's kind of avoiding a negative. That's a really important one.
Okay.
We talk about the three P's, three P's being performance, preparedness, and purpose. And in that second column of preparedness, I mean, we won't go through all of these, but this is a sort of like a summary slide of all of the different things that we talk about in the book as being business reasons. But I will just pick up on the first two, global challenges. I mean, we face massive global challenges, and we cannot rely on, you know, single leaders or single organizations or indeed single countries to be able to face up to these massive challenges. We need that incredible diversity of people and ideas to come together to find breakthrough challenges. And in order to do that, we really need inclusive processes to enable people really to contribute their ideas. And we'll be talking more about that later, but also to get the buy-in for the solutions that come up, whether it's addressing climate change or whether it's addressing something in your business. The higher level human skills is another critical thing that we will need to really enhance our higher level human skills as we work increasingly alongside smart machines. And inclusive skills are really all about those higher level human skills. So if you invest in training your workforce in inclusive skills, you're preparing your workforce for the future. And then the third P, if we could have that third column of purpose. Again, you know, organizations are under huge pressure today to be clear about what their purpose is beyond profit. This is becoming a bigger and bigger issue with investors and regulators, and the expectations are increasing. For example, with environmental, social, and governance issues, and investors really focusing on those. The social part of that has become even more important during the crisis, how companies actually treat their people, how companies treat their employees, and indeed, you know, there are other stakeholders. So that S part of ESG investing is increasingly critical too. Yeah.
So, right. So those are sort of the three P's that we lay out in the book. And, you know, given that there are these really clear reasons for inclusion, a variety of them, you might be asking, you know, what really is holding back progress in organizations? Why are we not doing better with making progress and making impact on inclusion? And, you know, some of the top reasons include failing to link inclusion to business goals. Another is reliance on what are often called best practices that often actually are ineffective. And then the other thing we mention in the book quite a bit is how important it is not to take just piecemeal approaches, sort of isolated initiatives, instead of a cohesive strategy. And, you know, we can see some of the limitations just by thinking it through kind of the lens of W's, these familiar W's. One thing is that most organizations, when they're looking at inclusion and acting on it, they're focusing primarily on individuals and their feelings, particularly their feelings around belonging or feeling valued, and also really focused on the internal workers inside the walls of an organization and keeping it sort of as an end in itself, not really connected to what's important from the business perspective. So these are some of the limitations that are getting in the way.
So what is really needed, as we've said, is a comprehensive whole system approach. And what do we mean by that? What does it involve? Well, it's really about understanding and taking account of and addressing all of the different component parts of organizational inclusion, rather than trying to fix, individual parts in isolation. And if we take the analogy of a tree, in order to grow healthily and to thrive, a tree needs to start from a hardy seed, and it needs water, it needs light and air, obviously. It needs nutrients from the soil, it needs space, and it needs to be protected from predators, like deer that eat young trees. And no one single part of that, no one of those on its own is enough. Actually, all of those things are interdependent. They're all part of the thriving tree system, and they're all crucial. And it's really the same with inclusion. So inclusion is often described as being about, a feeling, as Rebecca said, and a feeling of particularly of belonging. That's become a sort of bit of a new buzzword, or indeed a feeling of being valued. And actually, it's so much more than that. In our research for the book, we looked at inclusion in many different settings, sectors, social settings, and scenarios. And we came up with what we call the 10 inclusion enablers. These are things that really need to be in place in an organization to have a truly sort of thriving, inclusive environment. And these 10 enablers, we've clustered them, into 3 different clusters. So creating connection, creating opportunity, and creating common cause. And some of these things will probably seem pretty familiar when you think about diversity and inclusion. So things like openness and respect, of course, the importance of trust and fairness in the creating opportunity part. And then when you look at the creating common cause, maybe there are some things that are perhaps a little bit less familiar or less expected. So we talk about shared power. This is about distributing power across an organization and sharing power, exercising power with people rather than exercising power over them. And then another one, which is about participation. And this isn't just about being part of an organization. It's about truly having the opportunity to co-design how the organization operates and the processes that take place in that organization, and to contribute to better ways of working in the organization, and as well as to things like better products to address new markets. So all of these 10 enablers are important. they all need to be in place. But how can you actually sort of use them in practice? Well, we set out in the book, we set out there are about 50 different actions that people can take at different levels to start enhancing or driving inclusion right away in their organization. And we've deliberately sort of addressed these to people at different levels in the organization, because inclusion really is about everyone, and everyone is responsible for it. So this is just an example of how you can use the 10 enablers in some work that you could start doing. If you're a senior leader, you could set up a mutual mentoring relationship with someone who's very different from you. And together you could focus on how you can each become a more inclusive leader, whatever level you are in the organization. So perhaps a senior leader with somebody more junior, and use those 10 enablers as sort of core discussion points. How can what can I do to share more of my power in this organization, or to be more transparent, or to be fairer, for example. And if you're a middle manager, then here's an example of something that you could do, actually taking those connection, opportunity, and common cause concepts and really committing to them in order to increase the performance of your team on a critical business project, or to achieve a critical business goal. And then checking in to see what difference it makes to team performance when you do that. And for individuals, that's the next one. Really sort of working with other people in your team with your colleagues to look at which of these 10 enablers are already things that you're quite good at and which you might not be so good at, and then really addressing those, starting to address those, work out how to address them together, both individually and as a team.
Yeah. Right. And those 10 enablers are a really important component of what we speak of in the book about a whole and indivisible approach. And I'll emphasize that while they're important and well-researched, it's just part of our step-by-step whole system approach. And there's more to that. So we'll let you know a bit more about what more there is. We looked at this content earlier to look at what are some of the limitations of most conventional approaches to inclusion. And we find this popping up often by seeing these very simple scorecards that look just like this one, where an organization feels like they've measured inclusion effectively by asking a small handful of questions related to inclusion, usually, again, to individuals about their feelings of belonging and being valued. They've asked those questions as part of an engagement survey often. And then they're just looking at the favorable responses in aggregate. Maybe they'll do a bit more analysis to break it out by demographic groups and compare, for example, female to male responses. It's there. Once we start to ask some questions around that, we realize that that's really very limited information, given the kinds of decisions we need to make about inclusion and about the business. So we can start actually asking questions about how effective is this sort of limited measurement in terms of really being clear about how inclusive we are today, what progress we're making, which initiatives, actions, and strategies are actually making a difference with inclusion, and which ones, and how inclusion is actually impacting things like our internal and external stakeholders and the business goals and objectives as a whole. So we start to realize pretty quickly that we really don't have adequate information if we take that limited approach. So what we really need to do is take a look at a more holistic approach. So this is what we're describing here, that we start to look at who we need to focus on. Well, it's actually everyone. So it's not just individuals, it's also teams. And of course, it's middle managers and senior leaders. And, we also have to pay attention to the fact that this is about marginalized populations and groups, as well as the mainstream. It's everyone. We also need to focus on the fact that feelings are important when it comes to inclusion, and so are actions and behaviors, and what's most commonly left out, organizational structures and systems and processes that either signal and enhance or hinder inclusion. We also have to pay attention to looking not just at who's working inside an organization, but our external stakeholders and also external dynamics that can impact how inclusive we can be inside an organization. And we also need to pay attention to the fact that this isn't sort of a once and done and let's move on kind of approach. It's something that's continuous and ongoing. That inclusion shows up in every single interaction you have with another person, and you might be included in your first meeting of the day, but not in the second, and so on. So we need to pay attention to it all the time and in an ongoing way. And then another really critical piece is to make sure that we are making a really clear link between inclusion and its impact on our organization's ability to fulfill its purpose and be successful. So we actually have a model that we lay out in the book that helps take a look at what it takes to make changes across a whole organization to make it wholly inclusive, so that you can get those widespread and lasting results that are linked to the business. But rather than looking at this model, which might seem daunting, we'd rather sort of show an easily applicable example, so you can see how easily this can be applied in practice. And so we'll just walk through that. One of the main things that we know that helps with inclusion, not the only thing, but one thing there is good evidence to show is important for inclusion, is that people are able to speak freely, that they can bring an array of ideas and perspectives and ways of solving problems. They can ask discerning questions and have dissenting opinions and speak up when things are going wrong. All of these things help boost inclusion, and they also are really important for boosting innovation, which is important to almost every organization in one way or another. In a lot of organizations, there's this conventional approach of saying, well, we know we need to hear from everyone, so let's just tell people we want them to speak up and tell them, that might take some courage. It doesn't work very well. But an ecosystem approach where everything is pointing to being able to speak freely in a safe environment, in a comfortable way for each individual is what really works. So what we do is just start breaking down that ecosystem model into some very specific components. We want to first start by making sure that the link between speaking freely is really clear when it comes to what's important for business success. So here we're showing that innovation is core to this business success, and that being inclusive really helps people speak freely so that they can contribute that array of ideas and perspectives, and that can help with the innovation that's core to the business. So again, not inclusion or speaking freely just on its own, but because it's going to help the business succeed. We also need to make it really clear to leaders what's important, what's expected of them in terms of what their role is in fostering speaking freely for inclusion and innovation. So one thing we might do there is just establish a new competency for leaders, the things we're going to use to select leaders or to evaluate and develop them or to reward them. And that's going to be focused on the kinds of competencies they need to make sure that they're looking to a wider group of advisors when they're making decisions, and also to make sure that they're taking action to encourage people to speak up. Of course, leaders, as well as other people in the organization, need to have knowledge and skills and abilities that make speaking freely really easy to do. So we might need to make sure that we're focusing in on hiring or developing skills in things like active listening, or the kinds of things that help encourage other people to speak freely. We have to pay attention to the design of the organization. So we might, for example, say that each team has a Speak Freely champion that can look for opportunities to boost and elevate more and more speaking freely, and can also highlight any barriers and work to address them. We have to pay attention to the processes in an organization. So, for example, we might want to make sure that we start to incorporate this into performance reviews and also into rewards. And we need to make sure that we're engaging people in their beliefs and the habits that come out of those beliefs, so that they're overcoming that sense of needing courage to speak up, or that it might even be risky to speak up, but you're going to try to do it anyway. We want to replace that by giving experiences so that employees can know and believe that it's a really positive choice to speak freely. And that's going to be positive for the business, but also for themselves and their career. And of course, we have to pay attention to metrics and rewards. We have to make sure that we're really doing a good job of measuring, for example, assessing leaders on how effective they are in helping people speak freely, and then helping to make the connection between that and important positive outcomes for the business, like promoting more and more innovation. We collapsed all the external factors into one row here just for simplicity's sake for this illustration, but we do need to pay attention to those external dynamics. And we know, for example, an organization that sits in a nation or a state where freedom of speech is part of, the public policy, where it might be part of what people experience in education and more, it's going to have an impact on how effectively people can speak freely inside an organization. And as Allison mentioned earlier, organizations also have power and responsibility to impact those external dynamics and to make sure that you're working with things like your government relations to bring along the kinds of things and regulations and public policy, for example, that can foster the kinds of speaking freely or other inclusion that you need inside your organization. So, this is a bit of a simplified example, but it just shows you that we need to take a look at what's going on in each part of the organization and address anything throughout the organization that can help promote speaking freely and stop anything that might be getting in the way. And when we do this comprehensively and cohesively, making sure that not only have we addressed all these factors, but they're mutually reinforcing in an interdependent way, then everywhere employees look, they are getting signals to say that speaking freely is how we work here. And it becomes much more widespread much more sustainable. And because it does take into account the the connection to the heart of the business, it does help get business results as well.
Well, thank you very much for talking us through that really great example, which does help to make it very practical and applicable straight away, I think. So we'll summarize with some of the key messages that we're putting across today. So the first point being that inclusion is absolutely critical, because without it, that diversity is going to remain unfulfilled potential. And indeed, you can have backlash as well. So working on inclusion is really important. And that it's in order to get results from diversity, equity, and inclusion, it is really important to approach it as a whole indivisible system, and to have a whole indivisible strategy to do that. That strategy has to be linked with business priorities and business goals, and what you want to do as an organization, and what impact you want to have, both in business terms, but also in wider social terms across society. Everybody is part of this. Everyone has a role to play. And whether you choose to stand on the sidelines and do nothing, or to be deeply engaged, you have an impact. You can't not have an impact. And so we say that everyone is accountable, and everybody can experience exclusion to a greater or lesser extent. So everybody benefits from inclusion. And then, as Rebecca has outlined so clearly, we need to have structures and signals in place that guide that inclusive behavior, because every organization has not only very obvious processes that everybody knows about, formal things, but also informal processes and written and unwritten rules of the game. And so it's important to have these signals that are guiding inclusive behavior and enabling inclusion to flourish. And then inclusion works, inside out and outside in. It's impacted by what's happening internally, is impacted by what happens externally, and the organization can impact externally as well, and has a role to play in society in doing that. And it's important to have better metrics, and to have better metrics in order to demonstrate true impact, real impact with your inclusion. And this may all seem like a big deal, and it is possible to start taking practical action right away, right from today, tomorrow, or whenever you go back. Sorry, I've got...
Great. Well, thank you for summarizing those key messages. And we do want to emphasize that you can take action right away. We know that many organizations are actually finding it really difficult to maintain momentum for DEI at the moment, especially in the midst of the crisis. But we also know that some are really advancing and succeeding right now. Many organizations are actually engaging indivisible reading for action circles to get to that practical learning, to find individual, collective, and strategic action that can boost inclusion and those related business results. So it's a powerful but low cost and flexible way right now to advance inclusion in a virtual environment. So we'd like to take you back to another poll.
Yes, we've got one final poll.
Yes. So please participate. Yes.
We'd like to ask you the question that we asked you before, but with a better in it now. So I better understand what needs to happen for my organization to become more inclusive. So we'd love to hear from you on this one.
I'll be taking just a moment for people to get back to the poll site. So thanks. We see some responses starting to come in. Great. Good. Thank you for participating. This is similar to what we often see when we have an opportunity to speak to a group like this, that typically there are at least a few insights and sometimes a lot of surprising insights that there's a good sense of how important inclusion was and a good sense of what to do about it, but now an even better sense about the whole of what it takes to make the most of inclusion so that you can tap into that collective superpower in the organization. Anything else you'd like to say, Allison?
No, that's just it's really good to see that result, and we're looking forward to having a bit of a conversation with you in the remaining time that we have together. So thank you for listening so far.
Yeah, we're ready for questions and answers. I'm not able to hear you, Dr. Chan. You might be on mute.
I'm sorry, I was on mute then, but I was thanking Alison and Rebecca. That was really great. Thank you so much. And there's been some quite some activity on the commentary. I have to say those interactive polls are absolutely fascinating, and all credit to the CMI as well for bringing in the technology. Now, please do let us have your questions. Use the comments box for that. Just a very easy question, Alison, Rebecca, before we pick up with some of the others. We've been asked as to whether there is an audio version of the book available.
Well, there isn't yet. We really would love to produce that, but we haven't produced it yet.
Well, thank you very much for that. So that's something we're looking forward to. Please keep your questions coming in. Here is a question. Do you have examples of organizations that are doing what you've prescribed, this whole system approach, that is? Do you have examples of organizations doing that well?
Yeah, great question. And I mean, I think that it's fair to say that in our experience, well, what we've set out is very much at the cutting edge. We haven't seen the majority of companies doing this yet, but we do have a number of case studies in the book of organizations that are illustrative of the approach that we're describing in one way or another. And I mean, I'll just give you a couple of examples because of them we can sort of name some companies. The TV channel in Denmark, which is called TV2, did a very remarkable marketing video called "All That We Share." That was really about understanding the differences and similarities between us and stopping putting people in boxes or making assumptions about people. And it was incredibly powerful. It is a very powerful and emotive video. I'd be, if you haven't already watched it, I would definitely recommend it, All That We Share. But the point about it is that, it was directly linked to their new business strategy, which was about promoting inclusive programming in divisive times. And it was also directly linked to their purpose, which was about being a channel for everybody. And not only did it did go viral. I mean, it had the most incredible number of hits. It was shared across many countries. All of that produced the most amazing media coverage, which they calculated was worth public relations worth $100 million to the company. And every time it was mentioned in another country, it came back to Denmark. Recognition of the brand went up. So they saw these amazing business results from it. So it was really at the heart of what they were doing. And another brief example is of Sodexo, the global services company, which is actually, it's a very well-known company it has a very strong reputation for diversity and inclusion generally and internally. But in recent years, they've been hiring refugees into their workforce. And this is both for a business reason, which is to fill some of their talent gaps, and also for a wider societal reason of the kind that we were talking about before. really to address the global crisis, the global refugee crisis. And actually, I mean, they have seen some great results from doing that. So again, you know, they did it primarily for business reasons, but it had this spin-off positive impact. But I think some of the things that they saw were increased motivation and engagement on the teams where refugees were coming in. They increased their skill set and transferable skills, because so many of the refugees are highly skilled and are bringing new skills into the organization. And they point to research that actually shows that companies that hire refugees get benefits like enhanced reputation and sales and better recruitment, and that refugees in general have higher retention rates, so lots and lots of business benefits. And Rebecca, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I'm sort of thinking, in addition to the case studies that we have in the book, part of what I find really heartening and energizing right now is that some of the clients I work with are actually accelerating their diversity, equity, and inclusion results through the crisis. You know, I think of one company in particular that's taking an ecosystem strategy and seeing important results, like, you know, they have the full and abounding commitment of their board, their executive team. That includes senior leaders taking individual action and responsibility, plus things like, you know, they're fully resourcing, and I mean fully resourcing, their progressive DEI strategy, like they would any other business driver. And they're holding the organization accountable for achieving meaningful and lasting and measurable results. They're accelerating the DEI advancements through the pandemic crisis. And that includes things like advancing their focus to address targeted needs that are emerging. For example, those identified through the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement since George Floyd was killed in the United States. And this is really different from a lot of organizations where DEI was sort of put on hold during the pandemic, or where organizations were sort of frozen in how to respond to the Black Lives Matter resurgence. This client is also seeing things like new competencies, new behaviors, and difference in performance, such as, you know, improved quality of decision making and innovation and business continuity through the crisis, as things like flexibility and speaking freely and more are being reinforced everywhere in the organization, because they are taking this progressive whole system strategy tightly linked to what's core to the business mission, and seeing that come to life every day.
Thank you. I would like to go in just a moment to a question on colleagues and workers from racially diverse communities in organizations. Just before I do that, questions are coming in around, and you've touched upon this just now, around leadership. And because it's something that's certainly very close to my heart, having been group chief executive in a large organization and experienced the kickback actually from a whole industry sector on a number of things. From the case studies that you've just described, can you comment on the way in which people in the most senior echelons of leadership have been engaged? Because sometimes processes are driven by activists within an organization, often from within the human resources team or from a diversity inclusion unit. But long-term change, cultural change, needs to engage leaders. Could you comment, because there's some interest there, that one of the questions that's come through has been about how do we make sure it's not just a box ticking exercise, and of course it's about long-term cultural change.
Right. Yeah. We would say
we both want to answer this, don't we? You go first, Rebecca.
Oh, no, we're going to get, I'll just say briefly that one of the things that does make a big difference is this point we're making about making sure this is really clearly and tightly linked to what the organization has to achieve anyway. And that makes a big difference in terms of making sure that leaders are on board whether they believe there's something in the social justice position or not. And not all leaders do, if we're frank, right? But when leaders see that it's part of another lever they can engage to be successful in the things that they're being held accountable for, the things they're striving for anyway, that does make an enormous difference in being able to get commitment and buy-in and make sure that there is a long-term engagement in advancing inclusion. Alison?
Yeah, I mean, that is absolutely critical. I think the only thing I'd add is that I think increasingly any leader worth their salt is recognizing that they have to learn inclusive leadership skills, whether or not that is something that comes naturally to them or not. And I mean, I'm a coach myself, and I'm seeing that with other coaches talking a lot about this, that there's the senior leaders that we're coaching are really, really focused on this. How can, so it's partly about, what can we do to personally develop ourselves to better lead this organization? How can we become more open, overcome some of our sort of default behavior and so on. And one of the things that I always say about this is that it's one thing to work on yourself, which is really, really important, and to recognize your privilege, recognize your power, recognize some of the feelings, and be able to have a safe conversation about those feelings. And once you've recognized them and they're out in the open in a safe space, then you're able to move forward very often. But it's also important to build inclusion into the team around you. So if you know that it's not something that you're naturally skilled at, and inclusion hasn't been recognized as a leadership skill very clearly until recently, then you must make sure that it's built into the team, so that you have people around you who are challenging you on those points, but also making sure that people are brought along, that people are brought on board, and that can do that part of the work really well, so to complement you.
Thank you very much. Please, friends, do keep your questions coming in. The Chartered Management Institute is beginning to do a lot of work on in the whole area of race. And I've got a couple of questions, please, to run together here about how we can start a new network for colleagues and workers from racially diverse communities, where we could truly make an impact with allies, with advocates, and with all members who have a role to play. So that's a part A. And the part B, which is connected, is what are your experiences of the biggest barrier that those kinds of employees have said holds their careers back, and how we tackle it. So yeah, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Well, shall I kick off? Yeah, it's really good actually to hear the recognition, there that everybody has a role to play in this, because that is, a key message of our book, and also the importance of really having an impact, truly making an impact. That's also, one of our big messages. I mean, another of our messages, which Rebecca's talked about a lot, is that taking a piecemeal approach isn't effective, and based on our considerable experience and evidence, we often see that networks are an example of just such a piecemeal approach, and it can be particularly problematic, and it can indeed hold back progress on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We often see organizations sort of jumping to put in a network without recognizing that some of the problems that can come up, or that can actually cause. So I mean, I suppose thinking about just a few of those things that can come up. Those kind of networks or affinity groups often place the onus of change on the population that's already marginalized in the organization, to solve the problems that those people face, but that are not of their own making. And actually they they can ignore the sort of the whole mix of identities that make up each whole person, and that can't really be addressed or indeed fully, I think, fully valued actually by putting, different people into a single identity group. And I suppose another thing I'd say is that they quite often, networks can give the impression actually that an organization is investing in DEI, but really actually, leaving a lot out, and they're not really investing much, if anything at all. We've often seen voluntary networks being run, and just using employees' own time to do that. So, and Rebecca, I'm sure you'll have things to add about what can make, what is workable, what does work. Yeah.
Yes, and thanks for highlighting a few of the problems that we see with networks, especially as a piecemeal, isolated initiative. There are more, as Alison pointed out, but I'll stick to getting to what do we do about this? How do we avoid these problems? And I think the main thing is we need to question kind of the habit, I'd say, of so many organizations that just kind of automatically jump into going for networks and related sort of affinity or resource groups. And I think we need to interrupt that first by doing what we do when we work with organizations that want to start networks. We always start by asking the question, what are the objectives you need to achieve for the marginalized, racialized workers that in this case you're talking about? So start with what is the objective, and that might clarify whether a network is what you need or if you need something else. If a network is being explored as a potential solution to achieve the objective or the multiple objectives, we have to ask more questions. How does the network support both marginalized individuals and the organization's big picture purpose and goals? And how will we structure networks in ways that can involve the allies and the advocates that you mentioned earlier? And how will you measure impact? Not just activity, not just initiatives, not just participation, but actual impact. Is the network going to be a standalone, in which case our evidence would show that it's not going to be particularly effective? Or is it part of a whole inclusion strategy that is resourced and held accountable like any other business driver? And I think once you have answered these questions thoughtfully and you're really clear on the objective and how to measure success, then you can design not just a piecemeal initiative, but again, a whole ecosystem that can more effectively achieve those objectives and sustain results and impact. The kinds of systemic changes that we're seeing being demanded by all kinds of stakeholders right now. We need to take that ecosystem approach. And then, to achieve the identified objective, that again, that ecosystem might or might not involve a network. But if it does, that network needs to be very carefully designed to achieve exactly what it is supposed to.
Really, really great stuff. It's such a shame we're coming towards the finishing tape actually in just a few minutes. And there is one question I'd like to bring in, but it does occur to me that everything you're describing should be really part of just normal good business practice. And it's transferable into other areas of business activities. So if it was just, say, health and safety, a culture of health and safety is also an ecosystem around that. We shouldn't be having the kinds of disasters that we have had. I wonder, we literally have just a couple of minutes, but there's a really interesting question about a whole system approach. Do you agree that organizations should also consider their external contractors as part of their team in this context? And I suppose the supplementary is, how does that happen? But we only have a couple of minutes to try and give this answer.
Right. Well, just very briefly, I'll say something about that. But absolutely, that's very much part of what we're talking about in the book. So-called contingent workers or on-demand workers are an increasing part of most large organizations' workforces, and they often are I mean, sometimes they're very well paid, but often they are actually, in those sort of same categories as the key workers that we talked about in society that have sustained us through the COVID pandemic. And absolutely, they should be part of your inclusion strategy. And if you're not including them, if you're not consulting them about the way that the organization runs, if you're not including them and having, social connections with them, enabling them to participate in social situations that you have for your workforce, if you're not ensuring that they are treated safely in the same way that you would treat your employees safely, there are all kinds of things that you need to do for that workforce. And if you're not doing that, how can you truly call yourself an inclusive organization? Rebecca, I don't know if there's, or maybe if there's time, if there's anything you want to add.
No, you've got a minute left, Rebecca, please.
I think Alison answered that well, given the amount of time we have. So nothing really to add, except, yes, we do emphasize that contractors and contingent workers are part of who needs to be considered in inclusion.
Well, thank you so much. We're now coming, friends, towards the final leg, really, of this session. We trust you've enjoyed it. And we'd, of course, love to receive your feedback of whatever kind. It's fascinating to see the different parts of the world that people have called in from. And we hope that wherever you are, that you are well. I would like to express our thanks to all of you who have joined us, and especially to Alison and Rebecca for your insights and expertise. You've all heard about the book. I'm sure it's available wherever good books are sold, as they say. So please do. And if you have any difficulty, I'm sure contact us at the Chartered Management Institute. Please do remember that if you are a member of the Institute, you can access the CMI Women's Blueprint for Balance open source tool, which has a whole range of resources to help promote diversity in the workplace. And if you'd like to upload any resources, please do so by clicking on the link in the chat comments. So just a few announcements for the future. The next CMI Women digital events are on the 19th of October. That's Pay and Rewards with Andrew Baisley from the Fawcett Society. And 3rd November, day after my birthday, no cards please, Mentoring and Sponsorship with Emily West from Alchemy Coaching. And the CMI Women Chair, Dr. Heather Melville, will be joining Chair of CMI Race, Pavita Cooper, in the CMI Race Moving the Dial webinar on 20th October. So a full program of activity. For anyone new to CMI, please do click the link below to get access to thousands of practical development resources. I'd like to close with a comment, actually, which came to mind with one of the comments you made. It's from Helen Keller. She said, the world is moved along not only by the mighty shoves of its heroes, but also by the aggregate of the tiny pushes of each honest worker. And I think we've heard a lot about that in the context of inclusion. So thank you again for sharing with us today. Thank you, Alison and Rebecca, so much. Please, wherever you are, enjoy the rest of your day. Be well. And we look forward to the pleasure of your company at a future CMI webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Chan.
Thank you.